All right. Okay. I'll just go and dive right into it since I've used a bunch of our time. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Excited to share my work with you. So this is the original title of this presentation here, Acquisition Analysis of Post-Treatment Data. But as a lot of grad students know, coming up with the right presentation title to reflect your work is really difficult and dynamic. So I actually came up with one that I think is a little more effective at getting to the point. So I'll be titling this presentation, When is Invasive Management Successful? Quantitative and Qualitative Approaches to Investigating Management Effectiveness. And are these slides going? Just want to make sure they're moving along correctly. Awesome. All right, so quick project overview. So basically the bottom line of this project is that we are trying to evaluate invasive species management success in New York. But to do that, we first needed to determine the degree to which our current data would allow us to do so. And then we wanted to create systems and tools for evaluation, as well as sort of make recommendations for future improvements. So everything that I'll be covering today, it might be a little bit rushed because of the delay, but we developed a system for organizing data into documented treatment outcomes. We created a post-treatment data app and workflow for streamlining data collection. And we also conducted a mixed methods qualitative survey of invasive species managers. But backing up a little bit, evaluation, right? The history of evaluation. Have people been doing it? Has it been well constructed? The sort of short answer is evaluations historically have been imperfect. One of my favorite articles from the early 2000s plainly asked, do conservation managers use scientific evidence to support their decision making? And basically what they found in that study is that many management interventions are unevaluated. And this is key, although evidence exists, a lot of it is not actually accessible. Another study added that there's surprisingly little evidence to assess success of plant management beyond superficial metrics. And then yet another study was looking at the scale at which scientific experiments looking at management effectiveness happened. And essentially they just found that most experiments were too small or too short to be relevant to actual management and restoration. But they also noted that those limitations could be addressed by involving managers in research, such as all of you. And lastly, I'll point out that we have this big comprehensive management plan published in 2018, and the eighth focal initiative is to evaluate success. And in very tiny font there in the bottom right, they wrote that currently there's no requirement for systematic evaluation. And that's what we're trying to bring to the table here. So how do we do that? Well, we need to organize post-treatment data. So in IMAP, there are a lot of data that have been contributed for many years now. These are observation-based, and they're generally organized into presences, treatments, not detected records. But here's just sort of a screen grab from the iMapInvasives map viewer, and that's raw data. At a glance, you won't be able to tell if treatment has been effective or not without doing quite a bit of digging. There's no dedicated post-treatment data layer. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus in on those treatments and then create simplified visuals and summaries of the outcomes of those treatments. So this is sort of what we're driving towards. How do we do that? Well, I won't get too much into the nuts and bolts, but we did a lot of GIS and a lot of R scripting to organize this data. But what was that actually doing? So what that actually was doing was we were taking the treatment polygons and any sort of treatment polygons that might be spatially overlapping with each other, and we were converting those into management sites. And this is important to remember, we organize data into these management sites, and every management site is derived from one or more overlapping treatment polygons. Once we have those sites delineated, we want to take all the pre-treatment data and all the post-treatment data and bring it along for the ride, package it in. And those consist of all the presences, treatments, not detected polygons that might be overlapping that management site. This is a sort of more nuanced diagram of what's going on, but the important things to know here are that each of our sites are organized by location and by species. So each management site is just looking at one species. And we're also organizing by date. So we're looking at all the records packaged into each management site, organizing those by date. And then we're using sort of the flow of that information to summarize an outcome. So what are outcomes? So we had 7,805 management sites. And on top of each of those management sites was what we call a most recent record type. Now, these are important because they give us some basic information about what we know at each management site. So for example, if a site had a not detected record, based on our most recent information, we might assume that that invasive is no longer there. With a presence, we would assume it is there, and with a treatment, we don't really know. It's been treated, but we don't know what the outcome of that treatment was. Now, that's some information. It tells you something, sort of a presence or absence record, but we wanted to go way beyond that. So what we had to do is we had to look at data availability. So the first thing we wanted to look at was the availability of monitoring data. So for many sites, if monitoring data wasn't available, we would call that an unmonitored single treatment. Those were sites where they were treated and they never received any follow-up data. And so we don't actually know what happened there. That's a pretty big chunk of the sites. That's 5,300 of those sites. Then we're going to look at the sites where there is monitoring data available, and we're going to look to see if area and cover data are available. If not, we'll say that the abundance data for that population is missing. We don't have enough data to really say how the treatment affected the invasive population. So that's a big chunk of the sites as well. But for the remaining sites, we can look at the area change, and we can look at, did it decrease? Did it not change? Did it increase? And then for each of those, we can also look at the cover change. Same thing. Did it decrease? Did it not change? Did it increase? And when we look at all of our remaining sites this way, we get what we call treatment outcomes. So one outcome might be progressing. So if the area and the cover are both going down, we would call that a progressing site. If the area went up but the cover went down, that might be a mixed outcome. If nothing really changed, no change. And then if both things were increasing, we would call that regressing. So those are some outcomes of treatment for our sites where the population is still there. And then we also want to bring in our not detected sites. And for those, we're just going to look at, has it been 3 or more years since their last detection? If so, we might say, yeah, it's presumed eliminated. If not, we'll say it's in the monitoring phase. And I'll quickly note that for our percent cover changes and area changes, we noted an increase as just an increase in that categorical variable. And then for the area change, it was essentially plus minus 25% change. Okay, so that gives us this giant diagram that shows sort of all of the different ways we're looking at this management data. That most recent record type, we're looking at the data availability, we're assigning outcomes. And as we're taking smaller and smaller subsets of the data. And I want to point out that the last thing we sort of did was we really tried to simplify it so that it would be easy to communicate visually into these sort of evaluation categories. Negative outcomes are where the site is regressing. Neutral outcomes are where there was a mixed outcome or there was no change. And then a positive outcome are all of those sites where it's progressing or not detected to some degree or another. And I'll point out that that's a pretty good positive rate. That's about 2/3 positive sites for the sites where we have data available. And then, so what we did is we threw those into a dashboard and an interactive web map. So this is the public-facing dashboard. It's dynamic. I can't get into it too much, but I will be chatting about it on the next call at 1 p.m. But yeah, we really wanted a way for people to access and visualize this data. And once we have those management sites, we can also go beyond that to look at potentially what's driving the effectiveness of management. So here we have a descriptive data set, and here's just some examples of the different ways we can look at the data. We can look at them by treatment type, by growth habitat, by the invasiveness tier, the habitat type. What we can see immediately here is that there are some biases in the data set, almost entirely terrestrial, almost entirely plants, mostly forbs and herbs, tier 4 species, physical only. So there are some biases in the data set, and that can also help us figure out where our data gaps are as well. But we can also look at those variables and analyze them to see if there are differences in treatment effectiveness between sort of categories of each variable. In this particular instance, we're looking at growth habitat. So on the left, that's all of the management sites. On the right, that's all of the sites that we had sufficient data to assign a outcome to. And just as an example, in that tree column on the left of the bar graph, of the 40 sites that were managed for trees that have sufficient spatial data, about 70% of those had positive outcomes, but only about 20% of them were not detected. So those sites are more progressing than they are presumed eliminated. And our data here show a significant difference between, so shrubs and vines have a significantly lower positive outcome proportion, but take this with a grain of salt because we know that our data set is sort of both biased and incomplete. As we saw earlier, about 80% of sites, the outcome is unknown. And so we don't want to say definitively that shrubs and vines have less positive outcomes, but we want to show you that as we increase data abundance, we'll be more and more able to do things like this and really analyze how these different variables are driving effectiveness. So speaking of increasing data abundance, what we also did was we wanted to streamline post-treatment data collection. So to do that, we worked on a data collection app. Basically, on the left here, we have sort of all of the fields in iMapInvasives, and there's a lot of those, which is great. It provides people the flexibility to collect data the way they want to. But for a lot of people, they don't have sort of the time or the capacity to do a lot of monitoring. Other people might want to get volunteers involved, and sometimes sort of this full data fields list can be a little bit overwhelming. So we put together a sort of streamlined, standardized, quick and easy app that we had folks pilot test. We turned it into an app. I will also be talking way more about this at 1 p.m., so you can join me for that. But one sort of interesting thing we did add was a qualitative progress measurement field. And in that field, we allowed managers to simply just say how they felt management was going instead of us assigning the outcome using the data. And this particular sample thought things were going really well, which was really interesting. And that segues nicely into the last component of our project, which was this qualitative survey we did. So the objectives for that were there were many, to explore the definitions of success, to describe our sort of current ways that people are collecting data and doing evaluations, to supplement that numerical evaluation with qualitative data, and then also to talk with managers sort of candidly about what they think will improve management success. So the methods we employed, it was a mixed method. So we had three things. We did a document analysis. I did read every annual report from the 8 PRISMs in 2019, did thematic analysis. I distributed an online survey. Some of you may have seen it. Some of you may have even filled it out. A big thank you to those folks. We got great responses from all sorts of experience levels and sectors. And then lastly, from that pool, we did 15 semi-structured, roughly hour-long interviews, and we got a good diversity of backgrounds there as well. Sorry, before I jump on, there's a lot to unpack in the results of this qualitative survey, and I really don't have time to go over most of it. So I just picked a few things that I thought were interesting for this presentation. The first was that measuring success is hard. I pulled some quotes from the interviews, and people just shared things like, the tools we have suck, or we need to be better equipped, or the things that we're measuring aren't actually reflecting the success that we're having. So, if you've been struggling with evaluating management success, you're not alone. Other people are feeling it. So, how are people collecting those data? Well, we found that it was sort of all over the place. We described it as a spectrum from quantitative to qualitative oriented. On the one hand, you have people who collect a lot of data, people with robust data sets from years and years of management and scouting and surveying. On the other hand, you have people who just said, I don't collect data. And then we have sort of everything in the middle. And this is just an example of sort of the process that we had for taking these things people said and sort of categorizing them into themes or ways of thinking about how we do things. And in this example, we have this spectrum describing how people collect data, from data collection with lots of metrics to mostly qualitative reports with no data collection. And one reason this is sort of important to capture and to note is that, in the other component of our project, we're really looking at taking that quantitative data and using it to analyze the state. But via this process, we know that a lot of management that's happening is not, that data isn't going into iMap. It might not be going into any databases at all. And so that's a data gap that we need to be cognizant of and maybe try to fill moving forward. Because not all that data is getting into iMap, there's going to be these mismatches between what we get when we qualitatively survey people and the numbers they're reporting. So, for example, in our qualitative survey, we asked people how often they were able to conduct follow-up. Now, there wasn't a significant lean one way or the other. So basically, it was evenly distributed. Some people couldn't do a lot of follow-up, some people could. But from our monitoring data earlier that we showed from iMapInvasives, almost 80% of those sites went unmonitored. So we know there's a mismatch between those two things. Looking at goals, in our qualitative survey, eradication was a significantly smaller proportion of people's projects than containment and suppression. A lot of people saying very few of their projects were dedicated to eradication. But in iMapInvasives, a majority of the treatments were recorded as eradication goal projects. So we know there's those mismatches there. And we need to sort of keep in mind that there's stuff that we're missing. So there's a lot more to talk about from the qualitative survey, but here are just some of the main takeaways. Managers have struggled with evaluation of management for a variety of reasons. Funding, personnel, the tools available to them, and sort of this mismatch between the data they're being asked to collect and maybe what they want to collect or what they think reflects their work. Also, our quantitative and qualitative reporting are misaligned. We know that a lot of data is probably not getting into iMapInvasives or any databases, but there may also just still be a mismatch between the way we report numbers and our actual ideas about what's happening in management. And then lastly, the systems for evaluating success need to be flexible to the range of goals and timelines of management. Increasing the abundance of quantitative data is really important, but right now, as we see it, there is this misalignment. So we need to continue to use qualitative data to provide the full context of what's happening. So those are the survey takeaways. And then I'll lastly leave you with a few project takeaways, which are that we have these new quantitative tools, and they're going to serve as these first steps towards a robust system for evaluating and documenting treatment outcomes. We know now that centralized iMap data can be leveraged to provide efficient and accessible means for progress tracking and evaluation. But we also know that more quantitative data is needed, particularly in iMapInvasives, which is our centralized state database, if we want to really understand the effectiveness of management at the state level. And then lastly, success is context dependent. That was the main thing people told me in interviews. Success really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. But even given that, we are seeing lots of successes. Managers such as yourselves are really savvy individuals who have a lot of experience, and they've strongly emphasized prioritization and working on projects where the chances of success are high. So as long as we continue to be flexible about the way we report success, we can show that managers' work is successful more often than it isn't. And that is my presentation. And have a lot more to cover at 1 p.m. if you are free to join me, and we can talk more about those tools. But thanks for listening, and sorry about all the technical troubles.